Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is one that many believed would never happen, at least not publicly, at least not on Russian television, and certainly not in front of millions of viewers who have been fed years of carefully controlled narratives. What you are about to hear is not speculation, not anonymous leaks, and not foreign intelligence claims. This is about a Russian general, a man who spent his entire life inside the military system, openly admitting defeat and demanding that Vladimir Putin step back, live on TV. This moment did not just shock Russia, it sent tremors through the entire geopolitical landscape. For years, the Kremlin has maintained a strict grip on the narrative of the war. Russian audiences were told their army was advancing, adapting, winning slowly but surely. Setbacks were framed as tactical withdrawals. Losses were minimized or ignored. Any voice questioning the strategy was silenced, sidelined, or labeled a traitor. And yet, despite all this, cracks were forming beneath the surface. Those cracks finally burst into the open during a broadcast that nobody inside the Kremlin could fully control once it started. The general in question was not some fringe commentator or retired officer with nothing to lose. He was a decorated commander, someone whose career had been built on loyalty to the system. He had fought in multiple conflicts, trained generations of officers, and publicly supported the Kremlin's policies for years, which is exactly why his words carried such explosive weight. When he spoke, Russians listened. When he admitted defeat, the illusion shattered. The broadcast began like many others, a panel discussion on the state of the war, featuring military analysts, loyal commentators, and one or two uniformed officers. At first, everything followed the usual script. Maps were shown, front lines were discussed in vague terms. Phrases like operational challenges and temporary difficulties were repeated. But then the host turned to the general and asked a question that seemed routine. How would you assess the current phase of the operation? The general paused. That pause alone was unusual. On Russian state TV, hesitation is dangerous. Then he spoke slowly, carefully at first, as if weighing every word. He said that the situation was far more serious than officially acknowledged. The studio atmosphere changed instantly. Other panelists shifted in their seats. The host tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed concern. This was not in the script. The general continued. He said that Russian forces were exhausted, overstretched, and suffering losses that could no longer be concealed by patriotic language. He spoke about equipment shortages, poorly trained replacements, and units being sent into combat without adequate support. He said morale was collapsing, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they no longer believed in the mission or the leadership directing it. Then came the sentence that would echo around the world. He said, clearly and without ambiguity, that Russia had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. He used the word defeat, not setback, not delay, defeat, on live Russian television. For a moment, nobody interrupted him. That silence was louder than any propaganda. Viewers watching at home realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The general went further. He said that continuing the war under the same leadership would only lead to more unnecessary deaths and further humiliation for the country. He said Russia needed to step back, reassess, and most importantly, change who was making the decisions. Then he said it. He stated that President Vladimir Putin should step back from directing the war and allow a different political and military leadership to take over. He framed it as an act of responsibility, not rebellion. He said no single man should hold the fate of millions in his hands when it was clear that his strategy had failed. The host attempted to interrupt at that point. He reminded the general of the sensitivity of the topic, of national unity, of the dangers of playing into the enemy's hands. But the general did not back down. He said true unity could only exist when the truth was spoken openly. He said lies were destroying the army from within. He said soldiers were dying not just because of enemy fire, but because of arrogance and refusal to admit mistakes at the highest level. Within minutes, the broadcast was cut short. The channel switched to pre-recorded content, but it was too late. Clips of the exchange spread across social media at lightning speed. Even as Russian authorities scrambled to delete videos and block searches, the words were already out there. Russians shared them through private messaging apps. International media replayed the moment again and again. Inside Russia, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. For some, the general became a symbol of courage, someone who finally said what countless families of soldiers had been thinking, but were too afraid to express. For others, especially hardline nationalists, he was labeled a traitor who had betrayed the country during wartime. But even among those who condemned him, there was an underlying unease, because deep down, many knew he was saying what could no longer be hidden. The Kremlin's response was swift but cautious. Within hours, unnamed officials described the general's remarks as personal opinions that did not reflect the official position of the Ministry of Defense. State media avoided replaying the clip. Commentators framed the incident as a moment of emotional weakness, yet notably, there was no immediate arrest announced. No dramatic accusation of treason. That absence spoke volumes. Why? Because arresting a high-ranking general for speaking openly about defeat could trigger exactly what the Kremlin fears most: a wider fracture within the military. The Russian armed forces are already under immense strain. Morale is fragile. Trust in leadership has been eroding for months. Turning a respected commander into a political prisoner could push others to speak out, or worse, to stop following orders blindly. Behind closed doors, sources say the mood inside the Russian elite turned tense. Security officials worried about loyalty. Politicians worried about public perception. Oligarchs worried about instability. Everyone understood that the general had crossed a line, but they also understood that his words reflected a reality that could no longer be denied. Internationally, the reaction was just as intense. Western analysts described the moment as a potential turning point. Not because one general spoke out, but because it happened on state television, in a system built on silence and obedience. Intelligence agencies began reassessing internal Russian stability. Diplomats quietly discussed what a post-Putin scenario might look like, even if still unlikely in the short term. Ukraine's response was restrained but telling. Officials said the admission confirmed what they had been saying all along, that Russia's campaign was failing, and that cracks were appearing within the enemy's command structure. For Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, the general's words were both validation and motivation, proof that their resistance was not just surviving, but fundamentally reshaping the conflict. Inside Russia, ordinary people reacted in private conversations more than public protests. Fear still looms large, but whispers spread. Families of soldiers began asking harder questions. Why are our sons still there if even generals admit defeat? Why is no one held accountable? Why must the same leader continue to make decisions that cost so many lives? The general himself disappeared from public view after the broadcast. Reports suggested he was placed under some form of house supervision or medical observation, a tactic often used to quietly neutralize dissent without creating martyrs. His name was removed from official websites. His past interviews were scrubbed, but again it was too late. The image of him in uniform, calmly admitting defeat and demanding accountability, was burned into the collective memory. This moment matters not because it guarantees immediate change, but because it changes what is possible. In authoritarian systems, power often collapses not from external pressure alone, but when internal belief erodes, when those tasked with enforcing the system no longer fully believe in it. A general admitting defeat on live TV is not just a scandal, it is a symptom. History shows us that wars often end not when the last shot is fired, but when the narrative collapses, when leaders can no longer convincingly explain why sacrifices must continue, when elites begin to distance themselves from decisions they once defended. This broadcast may one day be remembered as one of those early cracks, a moment when the official story stopped holding. For Vladimir Putin, this incident represents one of the most serious challenges of his rule, not because it sparked immediate revolt, but because it exposed vulnerability. His image as the infallible commander, the man who always knows best, took a hit that cannot be fully repaired with censorship or propaganda. Once doubt enters the system, it is incredibly difficult to remove. The coming months will be crucial. Will more officials speak out, or will fear silence them? Will the Kremlin tighten control further, or attempt limited reforms to restore confidence? Will the military close ranks around Putin, or quietly begin to prepare for a future beyond him? No one knows for sure. But one thing is clear, something fundamental has shifted. For the first time in this war, defeat was not just implied by foreign analysts or enemy statements. It was spoken aloud by a Russian general on Russian television to the Russian people, and that changes everything. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to stay tuned to the channel. We will continue to follow this story closely, analyze what it means for Russia, Ukraine, and the world, and bring you the facts behind the headlines. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.